Hello, I'm Susanna Beaumont and welcome to Des Talks, a series of insightful and inspiring conversations with some of Scotland's most adventurous, curious and brilliant designers, artists, makers and curators. Today I'm talking to Dr. Gráinne Rice, who is Adult Programme Coordinator in the Learning and Engagement team at National Galleries Scotland, about the life and times of the truly visionary designer and artist Bernat Klein. Klein, who was born in 1922 in Serbia, moved to post-war Britain to study textile technology at the University of Leeds, moving in 1950 with his wife and collaborator, Margaret Soper, to the Scottish borders, where their energy, zeal and vision produced truly beautiful and groundbreaking textiles. And I'm thrilled to say, since we recorded this conversation with Gráinne, Klein's 1970s modernist masterpiece studio in the Borders, designed by the architect Peter Walmsley, has been saved. The Bernat Klein Foundation, National Trust for Scotland and Scottish Historic Buildings Trust have jointly bought the studio, which they will restore, revive and reopen. Many thanks, and I do hope you enjoy our conversation with Gráinne. So welcome, Gráinne. And just to say, first tell us what you're wearing, because it is Bernat Klein.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, talking about one of my favourite things. I'm wearing a Bernat Klein, one of the printed textiles dresses. It's got short sleeves and buttons down the front, and it is in one of the sort of peacock colourways, I would call it. I can't remember the exact name of this pattern, but it's blue with green, various shades of green in it.
I know it's beautiful because it's a real verdant green, isn't it? And I think that is what Bernat Klein absolutely relished, colour.
Yeah.
He rejoiced in colour and texture, and that dress is totally it. So thank you for wearing it.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So maybe we should start. We'll talk obviously about the life and times of Bernat Klein. But how did you first encounter, because you have this deep affection for his work and you have a huge wardrobe of his work. Mm-hmm. So how did it begin for you?
So I was thinking about this. Where did it all begin? And I think I first encountered the High Sunderland, his house and studio, through a project I did years and years ago, 2001, for BBC TV programme called From Here to Modernity, and that was with Kirsty Walker. I was a very, very junior researcher on that programme, and I think that's probably where I first came to understand that there was this incredible modernist kind of museum piece, you know, of architecture and interior design in the Scottish Borders. And then a couple of years later, I was doing some freelance work for the Lighthouse in Glasgow, Centre for Design and Architecture. And I was looking at design in Scotland in a particular period, and Bernat Klein kept coming up as a textile designer of other objects, and also commissioner of this incredible architecture. So Bernat was still very much alive, and I made contact and went and did a little research visit out to High Sunderland on a very warm July afternoon.
And how long ago was that, roughly?
In 2003.
Okay, so just over 20 years ago.
Yeah. And he was really patient and generous and very kind. And I was very young researcher at the time. So he spoke to me about his practice. He spoke to me about High Sunderland. Margaret was there, but she was kind of in and out. His wife was leaving just at that point. So I didn't really speak to her. And yeah, I just kind of came away quite overwhelmed by the experience.
I mean, as you say, I mean, the house you're talking about is High Sunderland, and his studio, which is just a hop and a skip from the house, designed by renowned architect Peter Walmsley. And so, as you say, they're tucked away the Scottish Borders in that curvaceous landscape. And I can remember driving past the studio for the first time, and you know, one's delight in seeing this beautiful structure, and then not being inside, but then looking at photographs, and then of Bernat Klein, and then of his clothes. Mm-hmm. And again, that totally whetted my appetite. So maybe we should now go back to Bernat Klein. He was born in 1922 in what was former Yugoslavia, into a very Orthodox Jewish family. he moved and studied to Jerusalem. And then, like so many writers, artists, graphic designers, moved to Britain to study post-war. Can you talk a little bit about him going to study at Leeds University and studying textiles?
I think it's also worth saying that his family were textile merchants. And I think that's a key part of the sort of early story. And he had studied in Jerusalem at the Bezalel Art School before he came to Leeds. So he had a grounding in an art education that was at the time reinvigorated in the worst possible way, really, when a lot of artists and designers of Jewish origin were leaving Germany in the 1930s. And one of his tutors was Mordecai Ardon, and there were others, but they had studied at Bauhaus. So when I spoke to him in 2003, that was something he was very keen to emphasize, is that his early art education was sort of a direct lineage from that Bauhaus approach to art and design and making. And then he came to Leeds, and one can only imagine what a kind of culture shock that was. He came from Jerusalem in the immediate post-war period and came to this, we know it and love it, but it's a cold, wet place in Yorkshire, and was studying kind of textile technology, and was, I think, eventually ended up working for a company based in Lancashire. That was just a moment in his career. But while he was studying in Leeds, he met and then later married Margaret Soper, who was a fellow student, I think, perhaps, and living in Leeds. And that was the kind of start of that very long partnership.
And of course, I think just to underscore what you're saying, this is kind of post-war. It would have been in the late 40s, 1940s. Rationing will have still gone on. And as you say, these can be overcast, depressed. I suppose a reshuffle of industrialisation and what was happening, but very much post-war Britain. And I think, again, I've reading up whether that helped spark this interest, or he brought this kind of sense of colour from the Middle East as well. And I think of all that kind of came together. So I imagine that, as far as you know, was that interest in colour and texture and textile started in Leeds?
I think it probably goes back to an earlier time in his life. I imagine it would have started in childhood. And certainly in Shelley Klein's fantastic memoir, The See-Through House, she describes his recollections of the house that he grew up in Center in what was the former Yugoslavia, and then also going back to that art school education that he had in Jerusalem. These would have really kind of informed, I think, that kind of passion for colour that is so evident throughout his life.
And then he got offered a job in Edinburgh. So that was the move up. And I think then he, and newlywed to Margaret Soper, moved to Galashiels. And I think it seems then that he seemed to take to or be curious about the landscape. And of course, we're talking about the Scottish borders around Galashiels, which is between obviously England and Scotland, but this kind of landscape that is busy with activity, mills, sheep, the crisscross of fields, of dry stone walls. He seems to immediately have a kind of visceral response to landscape and nature. Is that something you've always felt that was so important in his work?
Yeah, it is really curious, isn't it, that he comes from this very different cultural background and he comes to settle in Scotland. And the Scottish borders, as you say, are incredibly beautiful, very lush, rolling, kind of, there's a certain grandeur to the landscape there. And that he was able to sort of take inspiration from, again, a very different colour palette to the one that he would have known growing up. But I mean, anyone who lives in Scotland knows how the seasons change and the colour changes so dramatically with each season. He was immediately inspired and moved by the landscape, and that fed into his practice. But perhaps that came again from that kind of art school training of observation and thought about kind of the making process, the design process. And as you say, he started painting, and that would have been, again, harking back to art school training. And his paintings are incredible bursts of modernist abstraction. They're beautiful, really thickly painted, very vivid colours. And these have a very direct relationship to his design process. And that, I think, that's one of the things I really love about his work, is that, you know, you can wear a dress and you're wearing a work of art. You can, you know, have a piece of tweed or fabric that is directly a kind of a dialogue with his painting practice. And that is, like many artists, that kind of continual practice, that kind of dedication, that kind of focus. It's a way of working out ideas. And I just think that's so important when thinking about Bernat as a designer.
I mean, totally, because he does talk about that he gets how he understands what he is observing is through painting it. And I think one of his lines was, I experiment while I paint, but also that colour is as important in our lives as words. And I think painting was a way of seeing and a way of experimenting with colour and possibilities. And I think for me, when I first kind of was trying to understand his work, I, again, totally delighted in the fact that he was a painter. And I think he saw that as an equal status to being a designer. They were about a sense of exploration and understanding of the landscape. And then again, the way he talks about the vocabulary it gives him, like talking about delphinium or copper beech or grass and greens. And often those are titles of not only the fabrics, but his paintings. And I think again, I've always been very keen that is triumphed and trumpeted as much as his designer. Would you agree that they go hand in glove?
I agree, yeah, completely, because the painting so much informs where he was going with his design work. And to go back to the kind of example of nature, the Bernat Klein Foundation have been building up a fantastic body of resources on their website, including interviews with people who've worked in the factory, who worked for Bernat Klein. And there's a very kind of funny story about how he came in with a leaf, and it had to, you know, the person had to blend the yarn to match the colour of the leaf, and had to do it immediately, not in a few hours' time when the leaf had changed its kind of colour and had changed the nature of what it was that Bernat was seeing. And yeah, the environment that he created, or they created in High Sunderland, with the planting, with the trees, the views through to the Eildon Hills, really beautiful. And that just was so much part of his design process, looking and responding and incorporating those colours, those changes, the change in mood into the design.
That's the thing, where you can manoeuvre your kind of paint on a palette or on a canvas, and I think that enabled him probably to expect on the weft and the wove can replicate that colour of a leaf or aspects of that colour of leaf, because again that you've have an understanding of how fluid paint can be. And I think that sense of trying to understand the fluidity that is possible through weaving, maybe a little bit now. So they're living in Galashiels. It's in the early 1950s. He, I think, buys his own mill in Galashiels in 1951, and in 1952 he launches Colourcraft. In a way, that says it all, colour and craft. So just a little kind of wider sense of what was going on. We think of tweeds as being as quite kind of dowdy twin sets, and he comes along, somebody from elsewhere, somebody totally full of energy and ambition. So he must have kind of caused quite a stir within Galashiels and within the woolen mills of the borders. That's what we think he was doing, causing a stir.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was also extremely exacting as well. So I think some of that was kind of reacting to what a perfectionist he was as well, and what he had a really strong vision. He had a strong vision for his brand. He had a strong vision for what he wanted the kind of outcomes of his design processes to have. And I mean, I'm not a historian of this period, particularly for the borders, but the I think the post-war period was a kind of a depressed period in Britain, and for him to kind of go from starting a small mill with 4 looms, and then within 10 or 12 years he was employing hundreds of people with dozens and dozens of looms, creating new kind of textiles, innovating, pushing the people who worked with him and for him. It's wrong to say he was pushing them to their limits, but he was challenging them to what they could achieve with the materials that they had. And that's where the excitement comes from. He was taking these textiles made in borders to Paris and, selling them to couture houses. He had connections in America. He was working with Scandinavia a lot as well. So it's taking something that's very kind of local, that knowledge, that kind of experience of creating and making tweeds and woven textiles, which goes back hundreds of years, and taking it into a new dimension in the 60s and with different colour palettes.
I love the way that he started their big kind of first contract with selling scarves to Woolworths.
Yes.
And I kind of love that as something. And again, I always think of kind of post-war when lots of women wore headscarves. And again, kind of reading up on one of the books where that Margaret was on the phone because they hadn't quite got the order in on time, and that extraordinary, and again, that young innovator collaborative duo where it's still kind of hand to mouth. You're getting the calls coming in, but you don't maybe have the team to quite deliver. So that kind of late 50s, turn of the 60s, where it must be hugely. They talk about not going on holiday. Yeah, really quite a vigorous and rigorous timetable they set for themselves to deliver on the orders that were coming through.
Yeah, and I think it was fairly unusual that he was involved in every step of the process. I'm sure other kind of brands would have people who were very keen to be involved, but he, again, going back to this kind of very exacting nature, would be involved from the very kind of first designs through to procurement of materials, then on the factory floor and production, being very kind of hands-on in that respect, and then being the one who goes and takes it to the agents and to the designers around the world and certainly beyond the Scottish borders. So it's that kind of, there's an authorship there that's quite, again, kind of quite unusual, I think, and maybe leans into that more kind of artistic fiction.
Yeah, that he was the artist. And interesting because he often talks about putting up textiles and framing textiles and seeing that the textile has the, as you say, the authorship, but it has the integrity of an artwork. And I think that's it. So whenever he was producing anything, as you say, he saw it through because it was his name on it. Mm-hmm. So I understand. So he's doing this. They're working together in the early 60s, and then Chanel. So the glamour, the new look, I suppose we're just after the new look, but so Bernat Klein explodes onto the catwalks of Paris. That must have been quite exhilarating, quite extraordinary. Clearly he had a network, as you said, but this was also new. It was fresh and it came from the Scottish borders, and it had colour, it had zing, it had amazing textures. How do you imagine that was when this absolute shock and delight and awe of this new kind of textile hitting the catwalks?
I think the colour is the kind of defining feature of Klein's work, and I think I tend to think of those sort of late 50s, early 60s. In my mind, it's kind of still a bit of a world in black and white, and then you've got this sort of sense of this very kind of powerful colour palette that Klein was kind of creating, and it was apparently picked up. The textiles were apparently picked up, first of all, from the agents by the couture house, and after the first few kind of transactions or deliveries, then Klein wanted to become more involved in that process. So that was where he went to Paris and had these kind of conversations. And the textiles ended up in houses like Chanel, Dior, Balenciaga, also designing with or for Bonnie Cashin in America as well, which, you can spot the Klein fabrics a mile off. They're always really stunning. So yeah, it had a huge kind of visual impact, and he's really well known for the velvet tweeds, and these are kind of quite incredible fabrics which are unique blend of silk velvet ribbons that are woven through the tweed with mohair and other kind of colour yarns. And they're all incredibly beautiful jewel-like colours. And I mean, they're not the easiest things to wear, or they're not easy to work with either as a maker. So Klein would be producing the bolts of fabric, which would then be being made into garments by designers and couturiers.
So I'm just looking, the Evening Standard in 1963 says some of the prettiest, most supple and flattering tweeds shown in the French collections this year turn out to be Scotch. And then it goes on to say the incomparably lightweight tweeds woven in muted vegetable colours of carrot and lettuce and cream, used over and over by Chanel in her collection. Tantalising in tweeds, I think that was the title of the thing. So again, it seems to me that really caught so many eyes of the journalists and the designers and the fashion houses. And it seems to me that both this exuberance of colour, like kind of, I think I've read it's like stained glass, or I think Shelley Klein, his daughter, meant is like woven bumblebees, where you get this, both the texture, but it seems that innovation in technology as well. I mean, he was not just pushing the palette of colours, but this weaving together of velvet and mohair. And this was innovation. This was crossing into new territory of how fabric can be made.
It was. And I think there's a great interview with John Mackenzie, who was his head of design for a while in the brand. And he recalled there was a bit of resistance on the factory floor in the company to trying something as kind of, I suppose, wacky sounding as this. And they did kind of mock-ups and things like that. And actually the machines had to be retooled to be able to do this. So there's a huge amount of people. It's not something that's done on a whim. And I guess that's kind of something, again, to think about. We think about Bernat as being this kind of fantastic author of these incredible things, but it's a collaborative process. So in order to kind of create this incredible fabric, and people like Princess Margaret and the rest of them all wearing these beautiful, velvet tweed garments, that it required an awful lot of work, skills, experience, patience, And
I suppose that could have only happened in the borders because you have generations of people, of craftspeople who've worked in the mills, who have that knowledge, know the language of weaving and know the language of the loom. And so I think, again, you have to bring people on side, don't you? So I would imagine, because he was exacting and precise, but he was passionate and knowledgeable. And I think if you have that coming together, that ultimately everybody respects everybody else. One likes to hope. Yeah. But I get that sense.
An enormous amount of pride in making something that's beautiful and also commercially successful, that you can see in these magazines, the Vogues and what have you. There it is. The work that you've made is there.
And then just saying about this delight in colour in 1965. And again, this is a man who was constantly on the go. He produced one of his first books, Eye for Colour, in 1965. And again, suggesting his absolute relish for painting and colour, but also talks about the artists Monet, Seurat and Turner as the way that he looks at their palette and their techniques. And again, I think this always having a curious eye for colour. So whether he's looking at paintings in the National Gallery down in London or looking at the landscape through the window of the Walmsley by Sunderland, there's a sense that he constantly understands that he needs to fuel his vision by colour, observation and looking at art.
Absolutely. And the other interesting thing, I think, is that he not only had a vision for him and for his brand and for the products, but he also had a vision for everyone. He wanted, I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but he wanted people to dress well, to look good, and that he had this kind of system of colour that he created that related to that publication and later ones, where there were kind of colour palettes that were suggested for your eye colour. So it's kind of predates Colour Me Beautiful and these other kind of systematic ways of kind of dressing and creating a look. And he is a brilliant writer as well. That's the other thing. He's such a polymath. There's so many kind of aspects to his practice, and the creation of these kind of colour palettes, I think, is a really kind of, it tells us a lot about Bernat and how he sees the world, and where those kind of, when he goes to the art galleries, when he's making his own abstract paintings, where he's going with that in his mind.
And I suppose so now, just kind of thinking about the time. So this is kind of late 60s. The company is booming. They're opening shops. I think it was actually 1964. That's Sloane Street. I think then they went on and opened somewhere in Paris. So again, this kind of burgeoning empire. But then in 1969, he gets a commission from the Department of Environment. And I love this. If the same could be true today, and maybe it is, where a government department commissions a live and kicking artist designer to work on a range of upholstery and cushions and carpets. And then he starts working with manufacturers in Kidderminster. So again, this appetite to explore new territory. And I was delighted when I was at the National Museum of Scotland, Bernat Klein exhibition a couple of years ago, to see chairs. And that he'd been commissioned by the Department of Environment to design rugs, chairs, upholstery, everything. Mm-hmm. So what, and again, these wonderful contours of fabric. How do you put that within his just part of this just burgeoning appetite to design, and everything can be designed and designed well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes back to this idea of kind of good taste and good design. And the interiors are really fascinating. There's research that's being undertaken into that kind of part of the archive. Fiona Anderson's done some of the research on those interiors.
Is that through the Bernat Klein Foundation?
Through the museum, and through the museum archive. And it's an area that I think there's still a lot more to learn about. And I wish I had one of those chairs, or I wish some of those interiors had survived.
Do any still exist? I mean,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. There was a hotel he did in London. I think it was called the Imperial Hotel, around about the same time, and I went hunting around. I stayed the night there just in case there was something left, a remnant, but there wasn't anything I could find. But it is really interesting, and this idea that this ministry, and it was the diplomatic offices, so they had offices all over the world, and they would sort of choose from a menu of options that Bernat had kind of created, and like the eye for colour and the colour palettes that he created for individuals to dress well, that there would be a kind of palette of colours and options and textures. That's the other thing I haven't really said much about, is the textures, which are so kind of key. I think High Sunderland was really informative in this. I think that his experience of commissioning and working very closely with an architect like Peter Womersley, the interiors are so very carefully considered there. I can only imagine that it kind of influenced his thinking around the interior design projects that he took on.
It also seems that when I've been reading that he respected Womersley and his independence as an artist, architect, designer. And again, reading Shelley Klein, the youngest of his three children, talks about how exacting. Again, I was just been reading that Shelley as a child had a Wendy house, and it wasn't allowed to be on the front lawn because it would upset the sight lines of the house, and it was put further back. And then when she moved back to look after him, when Bernat Klein was an older widowed man, that she brought her own herbs, and he didn't want any truck with her pots of herbs. So I think he was very exacting, but again with Womersley absolutely respecting his vision and his eye, and the houses. I mean, Womersley's talked about being influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright and
Falling Water,
thank you. And lots of angular lines, but colour. But it and then I was reading, somebody else said once they're in the house, it was like standing outside with an umbrella, that it was so porous between the inside and out with these large windows and a lightness of touch. So his relationship with Womersley was lifelong, wasn't it?
Yes, it did. It lasted a long time, and there were two commissions. There was the house and there was the studio, and they continued to have a friendship even after the second commission had been completed. Womersley lived in the Scottish borders. He and Klein had a lot in common in terms of their taste, their values and their interests as well. So yeah, it was a really key, like you said, he really respected Walmsley, supposedly said, I'll let you get on with it in terms of the design of the house, made a few suggestions. It's interesting that the house was, in the time that the Kleins lived there, they had a couple of kind of iterations. They changed some of the interior. It refreshed it after a certain amount of time, I suppose, is the way to think about it. But it's a fantastic combination of Bernat's own fabrics, again, kind of using quite innovative techniques, hardwoods. It's, for a modernist house, it has a lot of warmth and soul. It's not something that you can't always walk into a sort of Mies van der Rohe in the same way and have that kind of really human experience, but High Sunderland really has it, and I think it is that relationship to the landscape, to the trees. You know, there's a sheep farm just beyond it. You just feel that it belongs there in a really subtle, quite unique sort of a way.
And I was looking at photographs, and there is, and now talking about Bernat's wife Margaret, there's a wonderful photograph of her sitting on one of the sofas at High Sunderland and with lots of swatches of fabric. Can you just talk a little bit about her? Because they were clearly a very collaborative team, working together as we said earlier, from when they first got married and living in a small little flat in Galashiels and commissioning Walmsley together and working together. What's her role, would you say? Do you think we've forgotten to talk about her as much as we should be? What's talking about authorship?
Yeah, I think we have, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone else, to be honest. And there is some new research that's happening. Lynn Abrams,
School of Art,
and the university, and Rosalind Chapman have been doing research into Margaret's role, and it's very much in the realm of the knitwear and the knitwear designs that the company produced. So there's a couple of different kind of levels to this. There was knitwear that was produced under the brand, and I think I understand that as being a lot of piecework done, which is not unusual in that part of the world. And then there were make-at-home kits that were created. So the customer would buy the yarn and they'd get a pattern with the yarn, and the pattern would have been designed by Margaret. So that's kind of really her realm and her kind of input into the company. And the patterns and designs, it really is, it's so dependent on the yarn. From my understanding, the patterns are fairly simple. I am not a knitter, so I can't say that from any position of experience. But they really kind of emphasize and enhance the color palettes of the yarn. So one of the kind of strands of the business, I think it was rolled out slightly later on, was the creation and production of yarn that consumers could make garments at home.
And what was also kind of happening as we kind of move into the 70s is new fabrics, not just wool, velvet and mohair, but polyester.
Yes.
And again, that sense of embracing and those were new technologies and new textiles, but enabled him to often then take a painting and photograph. I think he would often photograph in detail a painting, and then that would be replicated as a pattern for a dress, but it's also that ability to print onto textiles. So that was, again, that new innovation that he very much embraced.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what most people kind of would instantly recognise as a Bernat Klein garment or product. The printed textiles, which, as you say, were taken from his paintings. He looked for repeat patterns and printed onto, it had various different names at various stages. So Dialan was one of the brand names of the man-made fibre. It was also called Jersey silk sometimes as well. And there were different kind of grades of it. So some of it's really kind of soft and fine. Others is slightly kind of more robust. They are fantastically durable. They are brilliant for collecting because moths cannot get into polyester. It looks as fresh as it did in 1970, whatever. And they're really kind of quite iconic. That's most of my collection is actually the printed polyester textiles. And the shapes are, some of them are really kind of classically 1970s kind of shapes. They can be easily adapted into and changed. And lots of my garments have been modified, not by me, but by other people. And yeah, they're good fun as well. They're so lovely and bright and colourful. They're great for going out to parties, swishing around in.
And I'm sitting here actually holding a blouse, which is in this wonderful verdant greens and kind of delphinium blue. And I always think of a landscape because it's like contours you find on an OS map. And I kind of, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I kind of think he's looking at geology and everything, that sense of his delight in the landscape. But also, and again, you can see this in the bit of footage they've got up at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where the kind of fashion models are kind of wafting around in among kind of birch trees in this beautiful, and often the jersey polyester and this exuberance of colours. And it's quite, I suppose maybe we see it more with 21st century eyes, but very much the man-made fabric kind of in very much a landscape of the natural, but I likewise that exuberance of colour and these wonderful 70s lines of kind of pinched in waists and large pointy collars. I mean, I just think it's totally joyous.
Yeah, they are. And they were always mix and match. They, the incredible photography that Arthur Massey did for the brand, it's a combination of the printed textiles and the tweeds and block colors and then patterns, and the idea was it was kind of, I guess, a whole kind of look that would be produced every season. And yes, those videos, some of them, the publicity films were made in the garden at High Sunderland, and that's another really kind of important part of the whole lifestyle, is that they would have all of the kind of fashion editors flown up to Scotland and they would do catwalk shows in the house. And that was part of the way it was designed, was to have that very kind of, there are public spaces in it and it functions very much on that kind of level. But the publicity films of the models kind of moving around in the High Sunderland garden are just fantastic and really evocative of that moment, aren't they?
Absolutely. No, I could watch those on a loop. And as you say, when in their kind of sitting area at High Sunderland, where you see all these, probably very London-based fashion editors, but they're all with cigarettes, which again, you just don't want to see now for fear of falling ash. What do you think now is his legacy? There's been the exhibition recently, the National Museum of Scotland. There is the Bernat Klein Foundation. What do you feel he and Margaret, should they be better known? What's your feeling about
it? I think it's looking very positive. They should be better known. Bernat and Margaret are really interesting designers, artists, iconic figures in Scottish modern history. They are being celebrated, and kind of, as I said, I've alluded to, there is a lot of research happening, which is really heartening and really good to understand. But one of the sort of aims of the foundation that's been set up is to support and celebrate and the legacy through young designers and through next generations. So they've had residencies, they've created residencies with Cove Park, they've commissioned designers to make new work in response to Klein's design work. And that's very much within the sort of realms of where they are in terms of a foundation. The High Sunderland itself is under new ownership. The new owners are design historians. They love and they cherish the building and have given it new life, which is so exciting. There's been a beautiful film made by Corin Swan and Luke Fowler on weaving, which was released this year and shown this year, responding to the house and responding to those kind of personal histories of the people who are associated with the house. There was a lovely film made by choreographer Bridie Gain, Bernat, which kind of took the figure of Bernat and used the house and the landscape as a backdrop. The exhibition in 2023. And then, the studio, which is up for sale at the moment.
Yeah, we should mention at the time of recording that the studio, which again the Peter Walmsley completed in the early 1970s, is up for sale by auction. We're yet to know, as we're recording this, who will buy that, but there currently is a coalition between the National Trust for Scotland, the Bernat Klein Foundation and the Scottish Historic Trust for Buildings, with the support of the 20th Century Society Preserving Walmsley and with funding from the Heritage Lottery. So hoping it will go into their safe hands for renovation, restoration and reopening in some shape or form, but we have to wait and see. But just finally, Gráinne, firstly, how many items do you have?
Over 100, I think.
Over 100.
Too many.
Too many. But is there a particular one that you particularly relish? Or what was the first thing, maybe I should ask you, what was the first thing you acquired after meeting? Because you said you met Bernat Klein in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Was it then that you went off?
Oh, yeah, kind of almost immediately I started buying. So I bought a blue and green shirt, printed textile with a pussycat bow. And then the next time I met him in 2011, which was nearly just almost 10 years later, I wore that when I met him and he looked rather bemused. I do have a photograph I can show you. But yeah, it was, I think he was surprised that somebody turned up wearing his gear. But in terms of my favourite piece, there are some pieces that I go to and it's a kaftan. Purple with a sort of deep red, but it's mostly purples. Printed textile. It's got a little kind of high collar and sort of large flapping arms, I suppose. But it's great for swishing around with. And there's an artist called Carla van der Putler, who very kindly made my portrait wearing that kaftan, and it's part of a series of photographs called Artfully Dressed Women, something like that. That's terrible, I can't remember. And anyway, she gave me the opportunity to wear this garment and to talk about Bernat and what I loved about wearing it.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to watching some wafting in a kaftan. Dr. Gráinne Rice, huge thanks for sharing so openly and wonderfully your delight and love of the work of Bernat Klein. And thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to our Des Talks podcast. Please do spread the word, share, subscribe, rate and rave. We really want to reach as many people as possible, far and wide. And don't forget to explore our previous podcasts, such as our conversation with ceramic artist Francis Priest, jewellery maker and stone collector Stephanie Chong, and bench designer and bench maker Chris Dobson and Guy Phillips. And huge thanks to musician Malin Lewis for cycle lane, which accompanies this episode, and Ryan Scott Film for recording and editing Des Talks. Many thanks and do join us again.